Good to meet you.
Hi.
What's the point of studying English?
Well, I suppose the idea is that it's kind of a broadening experience. So there's kind of it might not necessarily have direct application, but it's about sort of broadening one's ability to think in certain ways. Such that having studied English, you have a broader ability to conceptualise other things, and simply for pure academic enjoyment, reading texts and getting more out of them, and sort of understanding more about the things you sort of consume in day-to-day life.
So a broadening of the way you enjoy a text, for example, is something like a personal pleasure, but a broadening that you think is useful also beyond your degree or not? I mean, what do you hope to get out of the course?
Well, I suppose it would be a sense of getting a kind of greater understanding of English literature. It's a subject that I find interesting, and I feel like coming out the other end of it, I'll have more ability to sort of understand the thing that I enjoy, but then also that will make me better at I suppose like the logical deconstruction of things in general. That I'll be a more rounded person in terms of being able to perform tasks and so on in jobs, because I will understand that process of logical thinking, forming arguments and so on.
So whereas, say, a chemistry degree, you might come out and be a useful chemist and be able to contribute to that society in that way, after an English degree, you'll be a better person, essentially. Isn't that a bit selfish?
I don't know if it's selfish, because if you're a more rounded, more thoughtful person, then you can contribute more to society. I suppose obviously that something like chemistry has a more direct application, assuming you become a chemist. And I suppose English does in that very specific sense if you become an English academic.
Right.
But I think in general it just makes you a more thoughtful person, perhaps someone who considers issues in a sort of broader cultural context, and that is of benefit in a more general sense to society.
Okay. What do you think you'll be studying in the course? How would you define literature?
Well, literature is a very nebulous concept. I think it's generally, I would suppose, be considered to be the written word, although that does exclude some sort of oral cultures, particularly in earlier work. But I think it's something to do with something which was written and can in some sense be considered to be of some sort of artistic merit. So you can talk about things that definitely are literature, like Virgil's Aeneid, and things that definitely aren't literature, like an IKEA catalogue. But there are probably some things in the middle which are sort of borderline. Perhaps some things that are written, manuals and things that are kind of have a literary bent, but perhaps not initially intended as literature. I suspect that more comes in with older texts, whereas I think in the more modern world there seems to be more of a clear divide between what's intended as literature and what is not. Whereas I suspect longer ago, certainly from my experience of reading, there was like a less marked divide between poetry and prose, and between kind of purely the written form and literature.
Can you say a bit more about that kind of blurring of the lines between poetry and prose? In what situations did they occur, what texts, and how did you experience it?
So for example, in something like the Iliad, it's a text which is in its native language is written as poetry, but is more often rendered in English as prose, which is to do with, well, from what I've read about it anyway, that in the Greek form things were more, poetry was the unmarked form, so things would be written in default as poetry, and that there wouldn't necessarily be this strict delineation between poetry and prose that we have in modern literature.
Do you find it problematic reading something like the Iliad in translation? Do you think that's a worthwhile exercise?
I think it's a worthwhile exercise, but it's something that you have to acknowledge that there are limitations to it. So there is a sense in which there's a lot to be gained from reading something in translation. You still absorb, I suppose, the majority of the content of that book and the themes and so on, but you don't necessarily absorb all of the nuance. So I feel like it's still better to read something in translation than not read it at all.
Right.
But you have to be aware that there's already been an active interpretation on that text in the active translation, which you have to be aware of.
So in a sense, you're still in touch with an original, but you're further away from it.
Yes, exactly. So you still absorb, I think, things which are worthwhile from that text, but you can't be entirely certain of the nuance and exactly what you have to, obviously you're absorbing it through the prism of how someone else has interpreted it and necessarily kind of lost some of the meaning in the course of that.
Interesting. So I'm picking up on your vocabulary here. So you're talking about losing meaning, but at the same time you say that when you read a text in translation, you can still absorb a large part of its content.
Yes.
What's the distinction in the vocabulary that you're using between content and meaning?
Well, I suppose that the distinction between content and meaning isn't necessarily one which is strictly marked. I mean, content is, I suppose, inherently, in a sense, meaning. But I suppose content more broadly covers things like narrative structure and so on, whereas I think meaning is more inclusive of concepts like nuance. So, I suppose you could say, the content of a sentence could be the basics of what's going on, the actions that have occurred, whereas the meaning could be more caught up in aspects of subtext, which are things which might be lost over the course of a translation, particularly when sort of idioms, particularly from languages more remote from English, like ancient Greek, don't necessarily translate easily into the English form.
And if meaning is, by your analysis, something that is possibly lost during a translation, and a translation is an act of interpretation, does that mean that the meaning of the text is something unstable, something quite personal?
In a sense, yes, because I suppose that all reading of text is an act of interpretation, in the sense that when one reads a book, like a novel, I suppose one person who reads Jane Eyre imagines it differently to another person who reads it. They identify with different characters, perhaps, and they take slightly different, I suppose, subtext from it. But there's kind of, I think with any text, there's sort of a kind of a distribution of the views people take, and I suppose most people centre on kind of like a more conventional interpretation, and you have sort of outliers. And so everyone has like a sort of an individual take, but often they're quite centred around a sort of consensus view in some sense. There is sort of some underlying general theme, even if only roughly outlined, which seems to run through most texts.
Yeah. That's interesting. And I wonder if the kind of then the outlying subjectivity, away from say the core meaning, which you thought that most people grasp onto, but there's an outlying layer of subjectivity. And I wonder if, in a sense, that devalues texts, do you think? If we're sitting here and talking about the great works of Shakespeare, for example, or the Iliad, and we're taking those to be great literature, but because of that sort of subjectivity, there are people who could completely miss that and think that these were useless works.
Well, it's interesting. I suppose with any literature, you have to accept that its value is in a sense subjective. And the reason that those works of literature are considered by us to be great works of literature is more in the sense of a consensus viewpoint than in the sense of everyone must agree these are great works of literature. I mean, there are plenty of 15-year-olds who think Shakespeare is incredibly boring, for example. But I suppose you have to accept that there's kind of, if something, particularly in an art form, is conceived of as having value to one person, then it has some sort of value to it. But if it has value to a lot of people, then you might more broadly consider it of being of value to society as a whole. If there's sort of a consensus among sort of people who take an interest in English literature that these works are interesting and of value and speak to some sort of the human condition or something similar, then even if not everyone agrees, the fact that they speak to a substantial amount of people is not negated by that. It's just the fact that it doesn't necessarily appeal to everyone. Not everyone likes skiing, but it doesn't mean that skiing isn't a worthwhile activity for those people who enjoy it.
Have you come across in your reading discussions of the canon at all, and the idea of the canon?
So the canon is an idea of the body of Western literature. Yes, it's not something that I've really done a lot of at school, but it's I think it's an important concept in the sense that all literature is in a way related by sort of chains of influence and even subconsciously. Would you have Dickens without Shakespeare and so on? And therefore, if you're studying Dickens, what do you need to know about Shakespeare and what is the influence there? What might Dickens have been like without Shakespeare? And these sort of ideas. And then I think there's also a sense in which literature generates some of its value by the existence of the canon. There's this kind of huge interlinked web of English literature, and so it makes literature in itself less subjective, because the canon is a broadening thing. So there's kind of people who don't enjoy Shakespeare might still enjoy Emily Bronte, or there's this kind of idea of it allows literature to embody a greater appeal.
Yeah. That's a very interesting take on the canon. What I was going to pick up on was that you used the word Western literature and asked what some of the problems of that might be. But in a way, you're depicting the canon as something which is actually quite democratic, or at least, rather than being something which is problematically exclusive, it actually is a way of bringing texts in and making them literature.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to move on to something more broad, which is, can you tell me about something you've read recently?
Okay. So recently I've been reading a book called Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, which is it's a humorous book, but it's written in like a sort of a chronological fashion. So things happen over the course of vignettes, and it has a kind of overarching surrealist bent to it. Like it's, I suppose the underlying theme of the book is the absurdity of war, but rather than sort of doing that in a realist way and attempting to portray I suppose like genuine incidents of surrealism before, it's a kind of overblown, the things people do are ridiculous, and none of the rules in this army make any sense, and they're all self-contradictory and so on, and the exchanges that go up the chain of command sort of inevitably result in grave miscommunications and so on. And so it's a way of, I suppose, it reflects reality by portraying a sort of fantastical situation. It's kind of a sort of reality writ large, if you like, which I think is what's most interesting about it anyway.
Yeah, if it's a series of vignettes and it's not in chronological order, does the work as a whole matter, or could you quite happily read sections of it and get much the same?
Well, I think it's very much a whole work rather than, but it's just told through these pieces. It's not. It's much more like a series of interlinked stories than it is like, say, a sketch show. There's a kind of it's the same characters and you get development throughout, and you learn. So there'll be one vignette that ties in with one earlier in the book, but it simply appears a lot later, and so that they're still relevant to each other. And it has this way, in some ways, the divisions of the book bring it together, because a vignette which explains something that happened in an earlier vignette sort of reminds you of that and forces you to constantly recall and reconstruct what's been going on in the book so far. And so I think it's sort of a deliberate tactic to force this kind of, I suppose, a constant sort of critical restructuring of like what the real story is, and because a lot of it's told through subjective viewpoints. So you suddenly get another person's view on a situation which you've seen before and read in one way, and then you see it from the other side, and there's quite a different story there. So that continually happens over the course of the book, which enables you to sort of build your own narrative and engage with the novel in a different way than you might with a sort of straightforward chronological narrative.
So it's perhaps deliberately challenging the reader?
Yes, I think so.
Have you read other works that you think do the same thing?
It's an interesting question. Not quite in the same way. I would say that the closest I've come is the Tarantino film Pulp Fiction. It has a very similar bent to it in that it's constructed in a series of vignettes which are achronological, but they do also link together, and you see stories from different sides, and kind of the film actually has a sort of ring composition to it, whereby the opening scene ends up being more or less the final scene as well. But just in between, you learn all of the relevant detail that surrounds how those characters got to that point, which is quite an interesting way of telling a story, sort of starting with an outcome and then going back down all of the various sort of chains of reasoning that led to that particular outcome, which I think is quite close to the construction of Catch-22. And again, this is not quite to the same extent, but there is an extent to which some vignettes slightly contradict others, or at least might mislead you into a conclusion which is then undermined by seeing it from a different point of view.
A slightly different question of chronology, probably our last question. The English tripos here is structured for the first 2 years around a series of chronological papers, 1300 to 1550, 1500, 1700 and so on. And you study blocks of text in chronological time periods. I wonder how you felt about that as a course structure. Do you think that's a valuable way to study literature or not? And if not, what would be an alternative?
I think it's a valuable way to study literature. I'm not sure if it's necessarily the way to study literature, but I think that there's a very good reasoning behind it in the sense that literature influences other literature, and that tends to happen in a chronological fashion. It would be very hard to be influenced as an author by a book that hasn't yet been written.
But perhaps not as a reader.
Perhaps not as a reader, no. But there's a sense in which the usually movements in literature are chronologically based. You know, sort of romanticism happened within one sort of time chunk and so on. Tends to be sort of there's a zeitgeist to a given period, which means that the literature is interrelated. And learning the literature that's gone before enables you to understand the literature that's gone after. So I think for studying the basics of understanding the way sort of English literature as a canon has sort of come to be is quite worthwhile. But then perhaps when you're going into more high-level study, you're trying to examine what the real drivers are behind the way literature works and how themes develop. It might be more a case of you need to study things with works from all kinds of different periods which are in some way related or you think inform that work, and not allow yourself to be limited.
Part 2, I'd say, the tragedy paper, for example.
Exactly, yeah. But that is something for which having that underlying chronological basis is probably very helpful, because you know where to look for things. And you have that grounding in how literature progressed, so that when you're looking to kind of pick out sort of broader and grander things from the canon as a whole, you know how to go about doing that, which I suspect is the intention behind the design of the course.
Well, possibly. I'm not sure. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yeah, how did you find that?
Yeah, it was okay. Took me back to the beginning. It was interesting to discuss things in a sort of very abstract way, I suppose. But I felt like I went relatively well.
I thought the strongest points actually were where you moved away from talking about things in an abstract way to specific examples. Obviously, that depends on the question you ask. So if you ask about something you've read, it's easier to move on to a concrete example. But where possible, bringing in and talking quite closely about the detail of text that you've read in relation to other questions. So I wondered if you could think of ways in which some of the first questions I asked, you might have been able to do that more definitely. So for example, what is literature? You brought in Virgil, but ways in which you could have given a bit more detail on that. That's the kind of question that's like almost certainly going to come up in some form.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So do you think there are ways in which you could sort of delve into the text a bit more there?
You could certainly pull out, ways in which it sort of conforms to a conventional definition of literature. It's written in a poetic form. It has a sort of fictional narrative to it. It has kind of a whole host of themes and character development surrounding, the nation states and what it means to be a leader and what it means to be a hero, and all these concepts of the family and so on. It has a lot of I suppose it's almost cynically packed full of literary concepts and so on. So it's quite an easy text to pull apart and make reference to literature in general with.
I think picking out those different bits is actually really good. So, for example, having knowledge of how form works, and especially if you've studied classics, you know about the kind of Greek basis for forms, which are then brought over into English. That's quite an impressive thing to show the interviewers, if you can. So that would tie very well there. And then using labels, so using the label form to talk about that, and using the label, say, common literary themes to talk about what you're saying about the leader and those kind of ideas. Being confident to divide text up into those elements, which is a way that you might say in a critical book, find a critic talking about a text, subdivided like that. Which points do you feel were the weakest points?
I'm not entirely sure, really. I suspect it got stronger towards the end. I think, if nothing else, just because I was getting more into the idea of answering interview questions.
Yeah.
But I don't really feel that any of it went badly, per se.
No, I wouldn't say so at all. You could, I mean, rather than things you did wrong, I think things you could do without going wrong, you feel free to spend more time thinking about a question and pausing for longer. So you were basically quite quick off it with responses, but you don't necessarily need to be. And it didn't, again, the scenario didn't come up where you really had to go back on an earlier idea, but again, you'd be very free to do so, providing you recognise that in response to this question, that's what you've done. And I think that's something that interviewers often try to make you do, is double back on things.
Yeah, no, quite possibly.